The Civil War was a bloody time period from 1861 to 1865. One of the primary and most outstanding causes of the war was the issue of slavery. Following the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, the divide between the country on this issue, along with states' rights, became dangerously large. The North, the Union, and the South, the Confederate, had reached its peaking point in peace, and war became inevitable. The Union intended to fight to abolish slavery, while the Confederate sought to keep it. The first official battle of the war took place on July 25, 1861, and is known as the First Battle of Bull Run.
An interesting fact is that the North and South have different names for this battle. The Union, naming them based on rivers, refers to the battle by Bull Run. The Confederate refers to the battle by the nearest town and is known to them as the First Battle of Manassas. Both are ultimately referred to the same event.
Strategy-wise, the Union had to fight and win an offensive war. Lincoln and his advisors developed a complex strategy to defeat the South. First, they would negotiate with border states like Maryland to keep them in the Union. Then, they would blockade southern ports, restricting trade with Europe. Third, they would capture strongholds along the Mississippi River, isolating the southwestern states from the eastern ones. Finally, they would advance into the Confederate heartland, especially towards its capital in Richmond, Virginia. Although details of this plan changed during the war, the basic outline remained the key to victory in the end.
Differing from the Union, the goal of the Confederates was to win the war by not losing. They felt that in order to win, they just needed to prolong the war long enough so that the Union would see victory as too detrimental to bear. When opportunities arose, they would augment this strategy with selective power strikes. The Confederacy had fewer men, less capital, and less industrial capacity than the North, but its defensive strategy might prevail, and if it could convince France or England to recognize and support its government, chances of victory were even greater.
There were many generals and commanders present in this battle. For the Union, it was overall commanded by President Abraham Lincoln. Next in the hierarchy was Brigadier General Irvin McDowell.
Pressure from the Washington politicians forced him to launch a premature offense against the Confederate forces in northern Virginia. His strategy during the First Battle of Bull Run was imaginative but ambitiously complex, and his troops were not experienced enough to carry it out effectively.
The title of brigadier refers to a high military position and rank. David Hunter and Samuel Heintzelman were also important Union generals in this battle. The Confederate Army was overall commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard.
Pierre-Gustave Toussaint Beauregard was a U.S. military officer who later served as a Confederate general during the Civil War. A native of Louisiana, Beauregard resigned from the U.S. Army in February 1861 and ordered the first shots of the Civil War. Beauregard was instrumental in the early Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run. Following the First Battle of Bull Run, he approved a new flag design for the Army of Northern Virginia after recognizing that the original Confederate flag looked too similar to the U.S. flag when seen in the confusion of battle.
Later on in the battle, he called on General Joseph E. Johnston for reinforcements. Richard Ewell, D.R. Jones, and Theophilus Holmes were also prominent generals. Another important member of the Confederate force was Thomas J. Jackson, who earned a nickname that holds to this day. The battle ultimately began when President Lincoln ordered Irvin McDowell to strike Confederate forces at Manassas Junction. The goal of this strike was to get closer to Richmond, through what he thought would be a quick battle. Richmond was the Confederate capital, and by getting troops there, the war would be over, and the Union would have been able to effectively conquer the South.
McDowell was cautious, as he knew his army was very inexperienced in combat. However, he had gathered together the largest military force seen in America up to that time. 35,000 men marched towards Richmond, ready or not. Beauregard's army consisted of 22,000 men, and they met at Manassas Junction. The Union's plan was to use two-thirds of their men to attack in the front, while the remainder launched a surprise attack in the back. However, his plan's major weakness was that it took skilled men to carry this out, which was what the army lacked. This factor allowed for the Confederate Army to establish their lines and consolidate positions. Commanded by Brigadier General Davis Hunter and Samuel Heinz Stillman,
an army of 12,000 Union men marched forth, yet were delayed by a large group of more Union men who stood in their way. Trouble in communication also arose between the Confederate leaders. The only clear success in the early stages of the battle was when Colonel Sherman of the Union found an unguarded ford at Bull Run. Crossing this ford, he engaged the right flank of Beauregard's army. This was unexpected and caused the Confederates facing them to retreat. However, the North did not win this battle. The defeat of the North in this battle was due to the capture of some of their artillery guns. Around the same time, two more Confederate brigades arrived at Bull Run. The Union was extremely overwhelmed, and as they withdrew, the South fired on them and created even more panic. This act led to the accepted loss of the Union and early success of the Confederate. In the midst of this battle, the rebel yell was born. As Confederate forces were failing, Thomas J. Jackson gave the order to charge men and yell like furies. They were then able to rally, presumably from this tactic. Used often by the Confederate soldiers, it was intended to intimidate their enemy and boost their own morale.
Stonewall Jackson graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, and then left the military to pursue a teaching career. After his home state of Virginia seceded from the Union in 1861, Jackson joined the Confederate Army. General Jackson received his nickname Stonewall at the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederate lines disintegrated with the onslaught of the Union troops. In an attempt to rally his men, General Barnard Bee pointed to Jackson in the distance, shouting, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians."
Although the South won, their troops were much too disorganized to pursue the retreating Union fighters, who reached Washington by July 22nd. The battle took around 3,000 Union casualties, compared to the 1,750 of the Confederate. Going into the war, many Northerners expected a quick victory, and their loss sent them reeling. For the South, they fell under the false sense that it was possible for them to pull up a swift victory. What both sides did not know, however, was that they were in for a long, grueling war that would take an unimaginable toll on the country and its people.
In the South, accusations flew between Johnston, Beauregard, and President Jefferson Davis over who was to blame for the failure to pursue and conquer the enemy post-battle. In the North, President Lincoln removed McDowell from command and replaced him with George B. McClellan, who would improve the Union troops. After, this army became known as the Army of the Potomac. All in all, the Battle of Bull Run was a battle that shaped American history forever. It was an incredibly bold start to the Civil War and made the way for the further battles.